Hello YouTube divers, this is WaterDive 122, and today I want to welcome you all back to another episode of Magic Metal Mondays. Today we are going to be talking about my favorite band of all time in any genre. We're talking about Rush. Now, this is a band that I've been wanting to do for quite a while, and on previous episodes of Magic Metal Mondays, we were talking about a lot of some of my other favorite bands like Metallica, Halloween, and yes, Slayer. Um, and I never really mentioned Rush on Magic Metal Mondays until um episode 5, my previous episode on Magic Metal Mondays, when I ranked my top 10 all-time favorite albums. A Rush album was on there. And I'm not going to say what it is because I'm pretty sure A, you already know, and B, I will talk about it in my next video because this is going to be a two-part series where I rank Rush's albums from good to classic. Now, reason why I say good to classic and not worst to best is because Rush never put out a bad album. There's no such thing as a bad Rush album. So, yeah, with that out of the way, today we're going to be here on part 1, we're going to be ranking 19 through 11, and then we're going to be going over the top 10 in part 2. So, with that said, we got 19 albums by Rush to rank, so let's get into it. Coming in at number 19, the 1996 album Test for Echo. Now, I'm pretty sure a lot of Rush fans would probably put this album last, and I see why. There's not really a lot of memorable songs on here, but there are some really good standout tracks. Like, my favorite songs on here, like the first 4 songs that open up this album, are freaking amazing. I mean, you got Test for Echo, the title track, Driven, one of the best Rush songs they ever did. Half the World is my personal favorite off of this album, and the color of Right is probably one of their most underrated songs that they ever did. But really, outside of those, except for the nice acoustic ballad that is Resist, most of this album is just average to below average at best. There is one god-awful song on this album, and that is Dog Years. I cannot stand that song at all. I hate that song. Which is kind of sad when you're talking about Rush songs. But that's really the only bad song they ever did, in my opinion. So with that said, the album cover is great. I kind of like the direction that they're going on this album. This is definitely the heaviest album they ever did. Although if I am wrong, please let me know. Yeah, with that being said, Test for Echo doesn't really impress me that much. I think it's okay, but there's just a lot better albums than this. So, number 19, Test for Echo. Now we're moving on to number 18, which is the 1991 album, Roll the Bones. Now, this album is basically a lot like Test for Echo, except with the fact that it's a lot more cheesier. Basically, like with Test for Echo, there's not a lot of memorable songs on this album, but there are some songs on here that are classics. There are 2 Rush standouts on this album, that is Dreamline and Ghost of a Chance. Those two songs are amazing, and of course the title track is also a fan favorite. It features the lead singer from Rage Against the Machine, who are also friends with the band. And we're another successful Canadian band. Like with Test for Echo, I believe there is an underrated song on this album, and that is the song Neurotica, which is the penultimate song on this album. I think the lyrics are very cheesy, and I don't really like the middle part of the song. But I do think the pre-chorus has a little good part. Has a great part. I don't really like the verses that much, but I'm not going to be too hypocritical about that. So, long story short, good album. just a little bit too cheesy for its time and for me personally. So, number 18 is Roll the Bones. Number 17 is the self-titled debut album from 1974. Now, this album is the only album to feature original drummer John Rutsey before he left the group to make way for the god of all drummers, Neil Peart. Yeah, but John Rutsey does a fine job on this album, and of course Alex Lifeson and Geddy Lee absolutely kill it on this album. But for me, what basically sets this album this low on the list is because it basically falters into my kind of flack that I give debut albums by some of my all-time favorite rock bands. At this point, Rush was not really that good enough to make an album that would be as good as the ones they would later be known for. I mean, this album is good. I mean, you got the classic song Working Man that closes off this album. What a way to close it out. Finding My Way is also another staple, and In the Mood is also great. I also like the songs Need Some Love, Here Again, and Before and After, respectively. Yeah, but this was basically Rush trying to sound like Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and Deep Purple all smushed in with one another. Geddy Lee, in my opinion, was basically trying to sound like a combination of Lemmy from Motorhead and Rob Halford from Judas Priest, and I guess Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin, all smushed in together. I don't know. But but yeah, this album. I mean, this album's good. It's certainly a great start. But compared to the rest of the Rush catalog, this one falls at number 17. Number 16 is the 2002 album Vapor Trails. Now, I'm only ranking the original version of this album. I'm not ranking the remix version because, this is basically all Rush originals, not any remixed or remastered stuff. But the main reason I have placed this at number 16 was, of course, the production. The production is very, 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 very bad here on the 2002 version. I'm glad this was remixed in 2013, I think. Yeah, 2013. Because, this album wasn't really well produced. This was the first Rush album that I was exposed to. I was exposed to this album when I was in preschool. Yeah, this was one of the first rock and roll albums I ever heard. And to be honest, it was mainly the second side of this album, basically from Secret Touch all the way to the end, is basically where I fell in love with Rush, if you thought about that. Because my dad was and still is a diehard Rush fan. He is basically what has gotten me into the band, if you will. At the time he owned 2 Rush albums, which was Vapor Trails and Hemispheres, and even the Snakes and Arrows studio version. But not anymore. My cousin Jeffrey owns that album. But anyways, getting back to my point here, the second side of this album is underrated, as you can say how underrated it is. Secret Touch, Earthshine, Sweet Miracle, Nocturne, and Freeze. Yeah, all those songs are great. And I also like the album's closer, Out of the Cradle. Fine. But the first side also has some great songs like One Little Victory and Ghost Rider, 2 more Rush classics, and of course How It Is. I saw them play that song, the song How It Is, on the R40 tour, in Greensboro. So, kind of how I was exposed to that. But, the dreaded production is basically why I have this album at number 16. Number 15 is Hold Your Fire from 1987. Now, in my opinion, this is my least favorite of the Rush 80s stuff. They definitely moved away from the synthesizers a lot, but they still kept that cheesy vibe in. But there are 3 songs on this album that I absolutely love, and that is Force 10, and the classic Time Stands Still, and Mission. And of course, Prime Mover is also a fan favorite, although it's not really one of my favorites. But the two songs that close off the album, Tai Shan and High Water, um, according to Alex Lifeson, he's basically said that High Water was basically the worst song Rush ever wrote. And I kind of agree with that. I mean, it has a lot of electronic drums on here, and believe it or not, I'm not against Rush using any of their electronic drums, because they definitely used a lot of electronic drums on their previous two albums. But on this album, it's basically but on High Water, it's basically put in way too much. But really outside of that, outside of those two below average tracks that close off the album, I think Hold Your Fire is a underrated album, and that it really shouldn't give the flack that it gets. So with that said, Hold Your Fire comes in at number 15. And number 14 is Power Windows from 1985, the album that came before Hold Your Fire. And I enjoy this album a little bit more than Hold Your Fire. Now, I actually have a copy of this album. I personally own a lot of Rush albums. I have Hemispheres, Caress of Steel, Fly By Night, 2112, Farewell to Kings, Power Windows, not Lime. I mean, Moving Pictures and Signals, and the Snakes and Arrows live CD, and of course Clockwork Angels. So that's 9 studio albums that I have from Rush and 1 live album, but so Power Windows. My favorite songs on here are Big Money, Marathon, and Manhattan Project. I also like the song Middletown Dreams and Mystic Rhythms. But this is definitely the most cheesiest song Rush ever did. Cheesiest song. I meant cheesiest album Rush ever did. And I'm sure a lot of Rush fans would agree with this. Depending on which era of Rush you liked between the 70s and 80s, then you could basically have this all over. I prefer this 70s version of Rush, but I do like the 80s stuff. I do like a lot of the stuff that they did in the 80s. But with that being said, I do think Power Windows is a solid album. And like with Hold Your Fire, I don't think it deserves the negativity that it gets by some Rush fans. But I don't know. And then now we are moving on to number 13, which, if my memory serves it right. Oh, yeah, that's right. Sorry, I just had to remember my list because I don't have it in front of me. I'm basically memorizing it. So number 13 is the 2007 album Snakes and Arrows. Now, this is a solid album, although I don't really like the studio version of this album. I prefer the live version of the songs that they did on this album. But the entire first side, but this album basically falls this low because it's unfortunately one of those albums that is kind of lopsided, because the first side of this album is freaking amazing. I mean, you got Far Cry, you got Armor and Sword, you got Work in the Mangels, you got Spindrift, and of course the 6-minute instrumental that is the main Monkey Business, The Larger Bowl, and of course The Way the Wind Blows. And then unfortunately the second side of the album, with the exceptions of Faithless, Hope, and Malignant Narcissism, is just kind of forgettable. But the good news is that there's a lot more positives on the second side than there are negatives. But for me, this album is just kind of average due to the fact that the first side of it is solid, and the second side is kind of meh. So that's why I have it at number 13. Moving on to number 12. Oh, man. I'm trying to think of what number 12 was. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Number 12 is the 1993 album Counterparts. This was, and basically it's kind of tied with Snakes and Arrows, because I basically feel the same way about this album as I do with Snakes and Arrows. the first half is amazing and the second side is kind of meh. But except on Counterparts, the second side is more memorable. I mean, you gotta Leave That Thing Alone and Cold Fire. I mean, two great songs on here. Speed of Love is also great. And then if you look on the first side, you got Anime, you got Stick It Out, you got Nobody's Hero, which in my opinion is one of the best songs on the album. Between the Sun and Moon, and of course the underrated song Cut to the Chase. My favorite song on this album would probably have to be Leave That Thing Alone. Great instrumental, one of the best instrumentals they ever did in my opinion. So with that being said, Counterparts is my number 12. And the final album I'm going to be talking about on this part, on part 1, number 11, the 1989 album Presto. Now, I'm pretty sure a lot of you are like, what? Why do you have this album so high? It shouldn't be this high. And that's mainly because this album was a better album over Hold Your Fire and Power Windows. Mainly because of how strong this album is. I remember being exposed to the first elements of this album when I was in 3rd grade. I would listen to the title track of this album, and I was like, what in the world is this? This is amazing. And then, very recently, I think it was like last year. Yeah, it was last year. I was turned on to this Rush song, also from Presto, called The Pass, which was a single off of this album. And this album, that song is just so freaking deep. It's one of the best songs that Neil Peart ever wrote, and it's one of the best, in my opinion. It's in my top 10 all-time favorite Rush songs. And then, of course, you got Show Don't Tell, and Chain Lightning, and Warpaint. You also have, granted, you also have Red Tide, which I believe is an underrated track. Hand Over Fist, also underrated. And, of course, the album's closer, Available Light. Strong closer, in my opinion. And Geddy Lee basically gets back to his high range, if you will. But, yeah, there's not really a lot of negative things I can say about Presto. I don't mind that this album is a little bit on the long side. I don't mind that at all. I love this album. So, that concludes part 1 of my Rush album rankings. I hope you all enjoy. And then tomorrow, when we do part 2, I will be going over my top 10 favorite Rush albums. So, thank you so much for watching, my fellow YouTube divers. This is WaterDive 122 signing out, ready to dive into more fun on YouTube. Thanks for watching.